Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 6 of This Week in FCPA. Today finds me flying solo without my cohort in crime, Jay Rosen. I review the comings and goings at Compliance Week 2016 and focus on what I think was the theme of the conference, the evolution of the Chief Compliance Officer. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of This Week in FCPA. Running a little bit late this week, but I wanted to recap some of the things that I heard, saw at the recent Compliance Week 2016 conference. It was a great conference. If you've never attended a Compliance Week event, I strongly urge you to do so. The next year's event has been set the last week of May before Memorial Day weekend back at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. The tone of the conference was set on the opening keynote, which started with Stephen Cohen from the Securities and Exchange Commission and Andrew Wiseman from the Department of Justice, where the key topic was the evolution of the Chief Compliance Officer and the independence of the Chief Compliance Officer going forward. So I'd like to explore that in the context of the overall conference. This key theme really resonated throughout the event. It really bookended. There was a keynote at the end, which I'll talk about on Compliance 2.0, which details some of the structural changes which have led to this independence, which have been put in place over the past 10 years. So a couple of other observations about Compliance Week 2016 before I get into the substance. The first was we had a lot of first-timers. And as you know, the Compliance Week event, it's really space-constrained because of the Mayflower Hotel. So somewhere between 500 and 600 is going to be the top-end limit. But nevertheless, it was very gratifying to see a lot of new faces, people that I had not seen in any of the national compliance conferences over the past several years, and a lot of younger folks. So a lot of new blood coming into compliance, a lot of people really looking to elevate their knowledge about compliance, and once again, Compliance Week delivered that in the form of the conference. So this opening keynote, though, really set the tone because both Cohen and Wiseman talked about CCO independence, authority, and resources as a key indicia of an effective compliance program. This was all in the context of the Department of Justice pilot program, the remarks by Wei Chin and Leslie Caldwell and Sally Yates about the operationalness of compliance throughout an organization and how you should go by demonstrating this if you're embroiled in a FCPA investigation. So Wiseman started off by noting that many presentations to the Department of Justice are made in the context of Philip factors, which is where a company generally presents evidence about the effectiveness of its compliance program at the time of the incident, which led to the criminal investigation. And he said one of the things that he thinks is important to talk about is how the CCO talks about a compliance program. Stephen Cohen really took this to another level when he said he wants to talk to a CCO early on, right after self-disclosure, because that's how he gets a sense of the company's compliance program. And I thought it was very interesting that he would want to do that and encourage the CCOs to come in and visit with him at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So some of the things that Wiseman said he would go into is how was the risk assessment done? How was it used? Use that information to springboard as a springboard into about had that information either led to the discovery of the FCPA violation or had it predicted it. It was really not surprising to hear Wiseman parrot McNulty maxim number 3 of what did you do when you found out about it, when he said that he would inquire into a company's response into whether that response was then integrated into the compliance function. In addition to Cohen talking about his encouragement of CCOs to come in and meet with him early in the SEC investigative process, that he said this was for a couple of reasons. First, the CCO is generally more attuned to remediating problems rather than simply protecting the company like outside counsel. So this was an important view for him to have and a useful view for him to have as a regulator. One of the things Cohen said he would specifically ask about is what resources are made available to the CCO, what is the level of CCO independence. Here he's concerned about whether the CCO is appropriately valued within the organization. Is the CCO a part of the executive leadership team, the ELT, or other top group of C-suite executives? He would inquire into whether the CCO had visibility into the transaction which led to the problem issues. It's not really whether a bribe was authorized, obviously, or I would hope it would not be whether a bribe was authorized, but whether the transaction itself warranted someone violating the FCPA to get done. Did the compliance function have a visibility into this? Had the compliance function actually advised against it? So it's all Cohen's way of ascertaining whether the CCO and compliance function have standing in an organization. Wiseman gave a couple of words about individual liability for CCOs. He reiterated that the Department of Justice is trying to reduce the risk of criminality for violations under the FCPA, and that indeed was one of the goals in hiring its new compliance counsel, Wei Chin. Chin enables the DOJ to be more robust in evaluating compliance programs of companies which come before the Department of Justice. And this new position heightens the power of CCOs within companies because it gives them a specific advocate at the DOJ during enforcement actions. Cohen took another approach to CCO liability. He said that he believed that over the past 10 years or so, there had been about 8,000 SEC enforcement actions, and only 5 of those involved individual liability actions around CCOs. So a couple of weeks ago, we had the FINRA action against Linda Busby, and both when the SEC and FINRA bring actions, these are regulated industry. So I don't think this is going to bleed over to FCPA cases. What about the question of CCO independence? Well, Weissman said one of the indicia is having an effective compliance program, and this may really sound like a circular argument, yet the more you think about it, I think the more that it makes sense. If a CCO truly has independence and can report wrongdoing and investigate those above him, that could be indicia of an effective compliance program. The DOJ, once again, through Mr. Wiseman, said it does not concern itself with whether the CCO reports to the general counsel or reports independently. The DOJ is more concerned about whether the CCO has the voice to go to the CEO or the board directly without having to go to the general counsel first. If the answer is yes, then Wiseman would want to know if the chief compliance officer has ever exercised that right. Finally, Wiseman next turned specifically to the operationalization of compliance. So he wants to know if the business unit is at least responsible for a part of compliance. So he even asked, is compliance operationalized within your organization? He had a interesting angle on this problem or this issue if the chief compliance officer if compliance is not embedded in the business unit. And he said if it's not, the CCO simply becomes the policeman and telling the business unit what it can and can't do, or as I would say, Dr. No from the land of no. And that's certainly not a position you want to find yourself in. Cohen said he had several questions which he would use to determine the level of CCO independence within an organization. First and foremost, is the chief compliance officer a part of senior management or the C-suite? Is the CCO part of regular meetings or of this group? He wanted to know if the CCO could terminate, and indeed, who could terminate the CCO? Was it the CEO? Was it the audit committee? Or did chief compliance officer termination require full board approval? Most importantly, Could a person under investigation or even scrutiny by the compliance function fire the chief compliance officer? Unfortunately, it's pretty clear if the answer is yes, the chief compliance officer does not have requisite independence. In addition to the foregoing, or rather, in addition to all of this, Cohen said he would ask, has the CCO, has the chief compliance officer within an organization been overruled, and if so, by who? Next, or finally, perhaps I should say, is what's the salary, and who is making the salary and compensation decisions for the chief compliance officer? Is it the chief executive officer? Is it the general counsel? Is it the audit committee of the board or some other group? So it was very interesting to hear this from the regulator's perspective, and I think this really goes a long way towards showing how CCO independence is a key theme, or a key indicia rather, that the department is going to look at. I found it very interesting that there was a session where three chief compliance officers talked about their dealings with Wei Chen. Their companies were under some sort of investigation, and they had actually had to meet with Wei Chen. And they all said that basically Wei Chen was testing to see whether the compliance program was real, whether it had meaning within the organization. How operationalized was it within your organization? How much did it work with HR, IT, internal audit, finance, sales, marketing, business development, supply chain? And these really probing questions, I think, pointed to the structural changes that have come about with CCO, or Chief Compliance Officer 2.0. So I wanted to go through those because this was a panel that was the ending keynote, and they really talked about and articulated the structural changes of the Chief Compliance Officer and how you might be able to measure some of those transformations, or measure some of those to determine whether you really had the type of independence and operationalization that the department was looking at. So what are the 5 key transformations that led to CCO 2.0? Well, the first one is empowerment. And here, the Chief Compliance Officer is empowered by the charter or the board to carry out its duties. The Chief Compliance Officer does not have to ask the General Counsel for permission, and they generally report directly to the board or to the audit committee. It also involves a Chief Compliance Officer being at the senior corporate level, often on the C-suite. If you've ever worked in the corporate world, you know that titles and positions matter, and being on the same level of corporate brass will give you more weight to carry the day. Number 2, independence. And here the key change is independence of compliance from legal. And if you think about it, the different mandates between the two departments should really speak to this issue, yet it's still a debate that's ongoing. The legal department exists to defend the company, and it may be asked to give an opinion on whether a particular act is legal. In other words, can we do it? The compliance function exists to prevent, detect, and remediate problems. The compliance function really asks, should we do it, not can we do it? Compliance also differs from legal that it should have a non-discretionary escalation of issues through an unfiltered access to the board of directors. Really, this should be a direct reporting line. So, does the compliance function have independence? Next, does compliance have a seat at the table? And I talked about being a part of the C-suite. I talked about being senior management, but it's also being seen as collaborative. This takes work and agreement by all parties. And it's one thing to say you have a seat at the table, but do you actually get to collaborate? So obviously the general counsel and the legal department are going to be close partners with compliance. But it really involves compliance being involved in all of the company's strategic planning meetings, so compliance can be proactive and not simply reactive. It also means involvement in risk management meetings, operational reviews, and budget reviews. because this is where the highest corporate priorities are set. Next up, number 4, line of sight. This is probably the biggest change in the structure of compliance. The Chief Compliance Officer should be able to see directly into the business functions, not through the eyes or even the lens of the legal department. It means the compliance should work towards an understanding through an integration of compliance risk areas for review with unfettered access to information. It may mean the business functions need to report up to the compliance through regular reporting channels. Finally, and by necessity, this means tearing down of silos so that compliance has visibility up and down this chain in line of sight. Finally is number 5, resources. I talked about that at some length in the around the opening session from Wiseman and Cohen in their opening keynote, but resources are something that has really transformed the compliance function and has transformed it in a way that has been certainly positive. It's budget and headcount. For budgeting, the change is the compliance function should have its own standalone budget, which should be sufficient to fulfill the corporate mandate. I think it's obvious to state that a strong compliance budget is always less expensive than an FCPA fine or penalty. So it would seem to me here that this investment is sound within an overall corporate organization. Certainly, research has borne out that those with more effective compliance programs do better in the marketplace, and their stock price beats the S&P average. Headcount is a corporate term for staffing, but it's more than simply bodies. It's bringing in true subject matter experts either through professional experience or internal training. It means that the compliance personnel should report to the CCO, the compliance function itself. If a company uses non-compliance departments, compliance champions, these folks should have at least a dotted line reporting to the CCO or the Chief Compliance Officer. It was really interesting if I could tie this to the Department of Justice pilot program, because in that part 3 of that, which turned out had a lot of input from Wei Chen, not surprisingly, there were 2 things that struck me. One was, what's your CCO being paid? Is he or she being paid on a par with other senior C-suite executives? So the Department of Justice is going to look at pay, but they're going to look at resources. They're going to look at headcount. They're going to also look at, and this is really for the first time, the professional expertise of your Chief Compliance Officer. So this is not going to be a place where you can put people who don't have the requisite experience or training. I recognize that we are a relatively new profession, perhaps 20 years old, but really as shown by the CCO 2.0 model, it's really in the last 10 years that the compliance function has stood on its own feet. So how can you show that you're really trained up and effective as a subject matter expert? Will it lead to a certification? I don't know the answer to that. Certainly I don't have a certification, but I think I have shown that through self-study and working in a field, you can become an expert at it, and I certainly hope you feel that way about my commentary. Nevertheless, these were new points that were in the DOJ pilot program announced back in April that you need to consider for your own Chief Compliance Officer position. So Compliance Week 2016 has closed. I hope you will consider attending Compliance Week 2017. This is Tom Fox. This has been a special edition of This Week in FCPA. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you again for listening to This Week in FCPA, Episode 6. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to visiting with you again and look forward to having Jay back with me this week. Thanks again.